Yeah, how's it going, everybody? It's the Masked Man, and my apologies for this video taking longer than I had originally anticipated. I just had no idea that Junji Ito wrote this many stories, and halfway through reading them all, I realized that I needed some time to organize my thoughts. Junji Ito is one of the most well-known mangaka of all time. I mean, seriously, it's to be expected to find his works in a manga store or in any bookstore that sells manga. But hell, you could walk into any store that sells anime merchandise, and I would bet you a decent amount of money you will find something Junji Ito related there. The last few days, I tasked myself with reading all of his stories, or at least the ones that I could find available to read somewhere. In this video, I hope to go over each of those stories, recommending and giving my overall thoughts on them, although I'll try to keep it brief and to the point. But the first story I want to go over is one that I've addressed in one of my previous manga recommendation videos. Hellstar Remina isn't my first Junji Ito story, but it is my first look into cosmic horror and really anything Lovecraft inspired outside of Bloodborne. The story persists of a scientist who names a planet after his daughter Remina, or Remina, listen. There's multiple pronunciations, I'm begging you bear with me. But after doing so, the planet sees the scientist with its giant eye and goes to Earth, eating every planet before finally arriving to Earth. This sends the people of Earth into a frenzy, some deciding to go after Remina, the daughter of the scientist, to kill her in order to appease the planet, while others make an attempt to actually go to the planet and land on it in order to survive. The Lovecraftian planet even uses its tongue at one point to spin the planet, which I thought was a really interesting but wacky idea, and before devouring the Earth, some people manage to escape in a shelter that simply floats through space, leaving their fate and the fate of humanity's future a mystery. Hellstar Remina is one of my personal favorite Junji Ito stories, one that left an impression on me regarding how it showed human nature when push comes to shove. It's a staple in his stories to take a normal setting and watch those normal settings devolve quickly into madness where everyday people get involved, but I think part of what makes this one special wasn't only his great art and concept for the Hellstar planet, but also showing the quote-unquote victims of Remina's wrath capable of such savagery as well. In true Lovecraftian fashion, this story represents existential dread and the madness humans feel when faced with a hopeless reality, and it does all of this in only 6 chapters. If you combine my fear of the ocean and my even bigger fear of insects, you would get Gyo, a 19 and a half chapter story about something you'll frequently find at anime conventions, the death stench. There's even a chapter called Stench World, which rumor has it will be competing with DreamCon for the stinkiest. It's actually about a couple that end up finding zombie fish with machine-like limbs that move around like insects, which is so skin-crawling upon reading that I can't even explain how much I hated reading this in a good way. Soon the machine-like legs even take control of a shark before escalating and taking over people, shoving tubes down their throats and up there. What starts off as a couple with a stinky situation turns into a post-apocalyptic nightmare of gas and machinery, seeing the world descend into madness, and a few were left to survive this machinery that might not even have been man-made. Easily some of Junji Ito's grossest imagery, but also some of his coolest, offering another memorable experience. To some of you, this might be common knowledge, but I wasn't aware that Junji Ito had manga that were actually just story collections instead of linear narratives, which is up to this point all that I had experienced regarding his works, until I read Smashed, a 13 story compilation with the most memorable for me being a 2-part story titled The Haunted House, where 2 kids wander into a haunted house uninvited just to find true horrors, including a man-eating monster boy, which ends up being the son of a man-eating monster woman who is married to the guy who runs said haunted house. The second most memorable story was actually a little bit comedic in the most sick, twisted way possible, so my apologies, and that's the title story itself called Smashed, which is about stoners that end up finding honey so good that it causes them to burst with joy. Sorry, I couldn't help it. Turns out, it's actually a mystical tree that smashes anyone who eats the honey. Overall, outside of these 2 stories, I didn't find the rest to be nearly as memorable, but that sort of thing is completely subjective, so as always, don't take my word for it and check this one out for yourself. Personally, I find the story collections to be a bit hit or miss at times, and that sentiment is strongest when it comes to Deserter, a 12-chapter compilation of various short horror stories, so nothing new. Now, I'm assuming that most of these stories are older from Junji Ito's catalog solely based off of the art style, which seems to be much less refined than how it looks in other works, such as Uzumaki, Gyo, and another one that I'm saving for the end of this video. Still, some of the stories in this one are pretty insane. My personal favorites being Scripted Love, Bullied, The Long Hair in the Attic, and the title story Deserter, which had an insane plot twist as this family found out this deserter, right, this military deserter, was a ghost the entire time who had killed himself long ago, as they find his hanging body after these fireworks go off with his face rotting already. There was even a brilliant line of dialogue beforehand kind of foreshadowing this, which you can see pretty clearly in retrospect. I really want to take some time to sort of talk about and appreciate just the brilliance of Junji Ito. I've only talked about, up to this point, 2 linear stories, right, and 2 compilation manga books, right, with short stories within them. But it's something special to see an author build something up over a long period of time. But in its own way, I find it just as impressive to be able to create a compelling story and a memorable one in such a short amount of time. It's really brilliant what Junji Ito's able to do, and the different feelings of fear he's able to create and invoke with all of his different works. I never feel like it's the same type of horror reiterated and just crappily redone in every single one of his stories. If not, I find a lot of brilliant variety and a lot of just memorable imagery and tales throughout all of this that I've been reading up to this point, and we still have much more to get into and cover. This one's one of my favorites. I'm going to say that like a few more times throughout this video, but if I had to make a list with like my 5 favorite Junji Ito stories, this one would be in that top 5. Lovesickness starts off somewhat basic. Normal school setting. This pretty boy shows up to the school. All the girls are into him, but he's into this one girl in particular. However, a couple years ago, her aunt basically like was having a breakdown and needed help. And so, as a little boy, he said something mean to her, which I'm guessing was the final straw because she ends up committing suicide and she was pregnant with child as well. And so, when walking down the streets in these alleyways, he ends up seeing her and as she haunts him. As well as there's this guy described to be tall, handsome, lanky, wears all black. And as he walks down the street himself with thick fog appearing over the streets, people ask him questions and he answers, and usually this leads to those people committing suicide or suffering some sort of tragic fate. As the story continues on, we then get to see the fate of our primary character as well as anybody else involved with him. And this was personally the most invested I felt into the characters in a Junji Ito story, as well as it just, again, being very, very brutal. Suicide is a common thing in the Junji Ito stories, but man, it was, As I brought up earlier, it's not just gross imagery in which Junji Ito is able to invoke fear and dread, but he also finds a really great way of creating tension just through the basic human emotions that some of the characters display, like guilt and shame, and again, the dread that those characters feel themselves. And I think his way of leaving the endings a bit open at times when it comes to his horror stories is another nice touch. Okay, I'm just going to get this one out of the way because I've talked about it before on multiple occasions, as well as this being one of his most popular works, so I'm pretty sure some of you are sick of hearing about it already if you're pretty well deep into Junji Ito. But Uzumaki is a story about spirals, starting off with a boyfriend and a girlfriend where the boyfriend's father develops this horrid obsession with spirals to the point they end up finding his dead body twisted into a spiral in this little circular coffin basically he built for himself before he's eventually cremated, and we see his spirit burn into the sky, eventually driving the boyfriend's mother mad as well, where she ends up basically killing herself by stabbing scissors into her ears. And slowly but surely we see the spirals driving this entire town where the boyfriend and the girlfriend live in go mad. It goes pretty crazy to the lengths and extents to the stuff that ends up happening. Definitely leaning on the supernatural spectrum, which is not what I was expecting originally when reading the story. The girlfriend should have just listened to the boyfriend and left the town when they had the chance. But overall, I found the ending of this one not to be the most satisfactory. However, this is my first Junji Ito work that I ever read, and it's definitely one of the most memorable experiences I've ever had reading a story. So it is one of his most, if not his most popular story, and it's for a very good reason. What happens when you combine one of horror's most iconic characters along with one of its most iconic writers? You get this. Frankenstein, which is where it actually goes through the story of Frankenstein before getting into another story I found to be probably my favorite stretch of the Junji Ito compilation sort of thing, if you will. I was so entirely hooked on this from beginning to end, especially the Frankenstein bit, where we get to see the creation of Frankenstein and the way that it's told through the perspective of the creator. But my favorite part of this more than anything was seeing Frankenstein, seeing him be built, and yet despite him being this monstrous thing, express some of the most ordinary human desires, and that's companionship as well as a purpose for his existence, something that he doesn't get when the experiment for Mrs. Frankenstein goes horribly wrong, and after the creator of Frankenstein dies, hearing him cry out in the cold that he no longer has a creator. It truly made me feel sympathetic for a creature that had done some horrid things throughout the story, like murdering an innocent child as well as other people. But I think in a way, part of what makes Junji Ito special is at times he makes his monsters seem human and his humans seem more monster-like. Something that creates a little bit of ambiguity regarding who's really at fault regarding certain situations, but you'd have to look at that case by case depending on what story you're talking about.
So if Frankenstein sounds interesting to you, well then there you go. I don't know what's been going on recently. I've just been like waking up randomly at 4 a.m. and then I just can't go back to sleep, and then God, my sleep schedule is so bad. I just want to sleep. Hey, look, I just woke up from a nap recording, so if the voice changes throughout the video, that's why. Okay, this one right here is an absolute treat. Truly, it is. Being able to see Junji Ito explore a little bit more of his comedic side with his tales and adventures of his 2 cats was really fun to see. Now, personally, I've never owned a cat. I've only ever owned a dog for most of my life. But even with some of the horror elements mixed in occasionally, it was nothing but pure enjoyment when reading this. I had nothing but a smile on my face seeing an author kind of explore this different side of himself and sort of, tell... It felt wholesome reading this, honestly. So if you're on a horror binge or you're reading the Junji Ito catalog like I was doing, and you feel like you need a little bit of a break from it, I would highly recommend this. It was a good breath of fresh air, which allowed me to sort of recharge and then get right back into his other stories. This piece right here is absolutely goated. So yeah, Junji Ito's Cat Diary. Definitely would recommend. This is another series I've covered previously in other videos before, and that is No Longer Human. Now, the one that I tend to speak about more frequently is the Usamaru Furuya interpretation of it, because I always love how it delves into that character specifically, and aspects of it which I found to be extremely relatable. Don't worry, I'm in a much better place right now, but... Ooh, boy, was I a mess. But both the Usamaru Furuya and Junji Ito interpretations are that. They are interpretations of the original novel written by Osamu Dazai, someone who... needed a hug. The Junji Ito version is a lot more horror-centric than the Usamaru Furuya interpretation, which is to be expected, which really delves into the character and shows them as a far more despicable human being than the somewhat sympathetic person I could somewhat see human in, ironically, in the Furuya interpretation, although the character is still pretty shitty person in that one as well. But I still think the Junji Ito version is still very effective in showing this character delve deeper and deeper into this and having to confront their demons of the past as they get older and older. And so despite my personal preference, I would still highly recommend you check out the Junji Ito one as well. Now this one I found to be one of the shortest reads, and that is The Dissolving Classroom, which is essentially this dynamic duo of this
brother and his younger sister, where the brother essentially like prays, and he doesn't pray. He apologizes a lot over and over again to people, and when he does, like, they start to melt and their brains melt into liquid, and then the little sister comes and eats it up. And then you see them kind of repeat this in different scenarios through, I think it's like five or six chapters. There's even one chapter where the little sister falls in love with another boy her age, which that poor boy. Another example that Junji Ito is capable of making an extremely memorable story in a short amount of time. So hats off to him once again. I had absolutely no expectation going into this one. At this point, my brain was sort of fried after a few days of essentially non-stop reading. But Venus in the Blind Spot was pretty crazy, as you see these people floating down a river and the bodies escalate more and more as they're being like stitched together. And it's so gruesome, and you can just imagine how painful all of that must have been. Now, there's a guy in the story who has a crush on a seemingly innocent and sweet girl, which, I mean, I think at this point I was like, okay, what now, Mr. Junji? What now? And so the guy finally musters up the courage to go admit his feelings for the girl, only for, at the end of the story, him to stumble in on her stitching her parents and their pet dog together. Bro, I was so... Oh my god. The dude has it all. He has stories that explore so many different varieties of horror, and even though some stories, I would argue, the endings were a little disappointing, others, it's the twist at the end, or the way that he leaves it off on an ambiguous note, that makes it so satisfying. It's as equally inspiring as it is infuriating to a certain degree, seeing one person capable of this many good stories. It just, oh my goodness. This is probably my least favorite of all the Junji Ito works that I've read. Again, just for me personally, all because it's my least favorite doesn't mean it has to be your least favorite, and that's Black Paradox, a story that starts off with a group suicide attempt, which ends up escalating into this weird situation where what was originally a group suicide now turns into this entire struggle against doppelgangers, and seeing these four individuals go through many different things as the story continues onwards. Now, again, despite it being my least favorite of all the Junji Ito works, I think what it's trying to communicate in regards to suicide is very well thought out and very well done, as I think identity is a huge part of this as well. Again, Junji Ito, throughout all of his previous stories, which I've been talking about, manages to include very important themes that is essential to us as people, layered through these horror stories where we see all sorts of atrocities being done by people and done to people. It's a good blend of Junji Ito's ability of using psychological horror as well as his typical grotesque body horror. But even though I see the value in this one, I myself didn't find myself nearly as captivated or as excited reading this as I did the other ones. But again, that's just me. Now this one I thoroughly did enjoy reading from beginning to end, and it's actually one of the collection story mangas, and that is Shiver. Shiver, without a doubt, near every story, made me feel things that I don't think I'd felt before when reading. I'm serious. There were certain stories, in particular the one with the people having the holes all over them, that actually made me scratch myself. I had never experienced that before. I guess I found out I had a new fear. But, yeah, Shivers. That was the name of the story. Oh, dear heavens. There was also the one with, okay, it's not funny, but it is the ever bit slightly so comical, again, in the worst way possible. It was the suicide blimps. Essentially, this girl commits suicide, and then there's this giant blimp of her head, and then all of these other blimps start showing up with like nooses attached to them, and they fly down and swoop people up and take them away. Which it was so absurd. It was so absurd, but again, I think that's part of what made it so memorable. I found this to be the strongest collection of stories, starting off with the record, which was actually the voice of a dead person singing the song of the afterlife, if you will, then going into the story with all of the holes titled Shiver, right, the title story. You then go into the ugly model, which turned out to eat people, the suicide blimps, the manor full of puppets, and then we get the painter, which is actually a story which belongs into a grander narrative of my favorite Junji Ito story of all of them, but I'll save that one again for later. So if there was any of the collection manga that I would recommend this one the most. There was cosmic horror explored in Hellstar Remina, but there was this story as well, Censor, which explored it even more. A story that starts off with this weird phenomenon regarding hair in a volcano, which turns into a terrifying story of just cosmic horror. Like, it's I don't even know how to explain. If you ever see a woman with hair that looks a little too good, never invite her to your village. Don't. The artwork in this one is stellar. In my opinion, it's some of, if not Junji Ito's best work. The creativity behind all of it and the way that he was able to portray this cosmic terror in which the story ends up delving into in a way that I find to be just as effective as Hellstar Remina. The story builds up and builds up more and more and more until we get the final images of Censor, which... Jesus, man. The final collection manga I was able to find and read that I'll be talking about in this video is The Liminal Zone. One that had, I'd say, two stories that really stood out to me more than anything. One of the first ones being a boy who, when he falls asleep and then wakes up, these murders end up happening, and so he thinks he's the one responsible for said murders. So you end up following him and seeing whether or not all of that is true or not. But again, this is just Junji Ito finding another way to invoke so much tension and nerves when you're reading. It's almost second to none, really. But the one that stood out to me more than all of the others was about a woman who cries nonstop, and I mean nonstop, and it turns out to be a little bit of a genetic thing that happens within her family, as we end up visiting a funeral of a woman who cries even with her corpse. This one was made it, I'm not kidding, this one made it a little difficult to sleep that night. I regret reading this one as late as I did. I personally don't enjoy this one nearly as much as Shivers, but again, that's just me, so you could check this one out and let me know your thoughts on it. Okay, we're finally here. Out of all the Junji Ito works that I had read, my boy Yanko, who is a huge fan of his works, was recommending me which ones I should try out and read. The first of which was Uzumaki. I told him I'd already read it, so then he recommended me this one, Tomie. A linear story of essentially what ends up being, my opinion, Junji Ito's best work. We see this girl called Tomie who, the story starts off with her in a romantic relationship with a teacher. She ends up being killed, and in order to cover it up, her body is chopped up into bits and then thrown those pieces into a lake or a river. And we end up following these different stories of these different bits sort of regenerating and becoming their own person, and we see how these different Tomies end up driving all of these different people mad. However, I find something really interesting in this story being, despite Tomie herself, especially in certain stories, coming off as this incredibly vain, narcissistic person who is clearly driving people insane, the things that seem equally monstrous as she does in certain moments is actually all of the men she ends up driving to madness, who end up doing all of these atrocious things in order to appease her. There was a point in one of the stories where I was actually like, this is literally just simps and Twitch streamers made into a manga with some horror. But anyways, one of the stories that stuck out to me the most was actually one that appeared in Shivers, which was a pleasant surprise since I had read Tomie before reading Shivers, and that was The Painter. This painter who once had a model and was an amazing artist before meeting Tomie at a gallery and now desiring to paint her true beauty, going insane over the fact that he wasn't able to satisfy her in doing so until he finally achieves the ability to do so. But he had to visit another artist who was doing the same thing regarding sculptures. And this is something that I had mentioned when talking about Hellstar Remina, but Junji Ito's decision to convey what I thought was this force of nature, really, because that's what Tomie sort of becomes, push people to their absolute brink and showing their true perverted, twisted nature was really my favorite part of all of this. Again, it's not just the horrors of Tomie and the fact that she should be dead but isn't, but it's seeing all of these people do all sorts of things in order just to simply satisfy her. And really thinking about it, part of what makes it so interesting is that Tomie is really the most human of all of the quote-unquote, I guess, antagonistic forces. And that was part of what made Frankenstein so interesting to me, was despite him being a literal monster, he showed very human core desires, but Tomie shows fear, and the people that end up killing her end up always blaming her despite it clearly being their fault. I mean, again, yes, Tomie does display very negative qualities and traits and sort of pushes these people, but that doesn't absolve them from any of the blame of killing this girl repeatedly. The story starts off with her getting chopped into bits, and the story only continues with her dying over and over and over again. So it sort of asks the question, who's really at fault here? Which I loved, and again, along with the artwork, is part of what makes this my favorite Junji Ito story out of all of them. So if I could only recommend one of the Junji Ito stories, it would be this one, Tomie. After reading, I think, most of his catalog, if I missed anything, let me know. I probably did. But I could say without a doubt, this is easily one of the premier mangaka of all time. It doesn't really get all too much better than this. Having an author with the ability to have his own style be consistent throughout all of his stories, but yet it not becoming tiresome as he finds different ways of exploring horror in its vast potential in really such a great manner. I've never felt so many different fears of mine being exploited back to back to back to back until going through this. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you are new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and turn on the bell notifications. And as always, this has been The Masked Man. Hope everyone has a blessed rest of the day, and peace.